Assassin's Creed 3 saw large overhauls to the mechanics of the Assassin's Creed series, with Liberation and Black Flag taking that a step further. But rather than focusing on expanding your assassin abilities, Black Flag focused on your pirate skills. Unfortunately, some fans felt that while they enjoyed the story presented in Black Flag, there wasn't a ton of the traditional gameplay that the series was known for, which admittedly is the kind of fresh innovation that made people like me fall in love with Black Flag in the first place. It was this yearning for a traditional experience that made the standalone DLC Freedom Cry so appealing. Starring the previously quartermaster turned assassin Adewale, 15 years after the events of Black Flag, Freedom Cry sees you returning to your roots with a tried and true gameplay loop, but not much else. Before diving headfirst into Freedom Cry, we have to talk about price point and purpose. Freedom Cry, as of writing this video, costs 15 Canadian dollars. Considering that Liberation HD costs 20 Canadian dollars and acts as a spin-off of its sister game, comparisons are sure to follow. It's these comparisons that bothered me the most about Freedom Cry. Despite having an immediately likable character and familiar and enjoyable gameplay with interesting twists, I was feeling as though Liberation was a more enjoyable time and a better use of your cash. Something I could not shake while playing Freedom Cry was the question of who was this made for? I found it difficult to nail down the game's purpose or what they want to achieve with it. So let's not delay any further and dive into the Deep Blue once again and talk about Freedom Cry, the game without much of a purpose. But first, a word from our sponsor. Have you ever felt that your diet might not be the best? Don't lie to me, alright? We're gamers. We run off chips and sodas on most days, but at some point, we gotta get our eating habits together, and today's sponsor, HelloFresh, is the perfect solution. I cook for my family a few times a week, and they can be picky, so having 55 weekly recipes to choose from makes finding meals that everyone agrees on easy. Once the recipes are chosen, they arrive within the week and are separated into perfect portions and include an easy-to-follow guide. And you guys know my monkey brain. If I can follow this stuff, you can too. Make cheesy spinach and mushroom stromboli with sweet and spicy apricot chicken to wow any guest and do it in a fraction of the time. My favorite part of HelloFresh is that they accommodate every dietary restriction. I'm both celiac and lactose intolerant, meaning my options are limited on a good day, but HelloFresh has both of these bases along with others covered, which is actually why I like it so much and continue to use it. Well, I guess I also like saving the money and time, but not being glued to the bowl for 3 hours after eating is pretty good too. You can use my link or go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGAquaJuly16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes, plus 3 free gifts. Once you click, my description will live update to count the amount of purchases. Guys, they put POG in the code. It doesn't get cooler than that. What are you waiting for? Start eating better, saving money, saving time, and get some delicious meals along the way. And thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. The game begins much like Black Flag did, with Adewale on a ship tracking down a Templar package and being shipwrecked. Washing ashore on Port-au-Prince. It's there that he meets with the local Maroons, their leader Augustine, and the owner of a local brothel, Bastien. Bastien is working with Templars but seems to have ulterior motives to help the slaves. As Ade attempts to strengthen the numbers of the Maroons and himself, he'll do, ironically, a lot more liberating than Adewale. Much like her, Adewale is looking to help the local slave population. This is where a majority of your side questing, and unfortunately a lot of where your main questing will be too. But before we look at how this game pads its slim runtime, let's look at the different ways to grow your numbers. The first is an overworld of freeing slaves. I'm bunching these all together as a single activity because they all function relatively the same. You'll see some slaves that are up for auction being punished, transported, chased, jailed, and your objective is to always defeat the enemies in the area and free/talk to the slaves. It isn't much, but I don't think that on its own it needs to be. The other games didn't have much for overworld activities outside of some thieves and a few collectibles, so having a near constant excuse to engage with the gameplay is a good thing. You'll almost always have one of these nearby, with the biggest problem being that your heads-up display can feel really cluttered, especially if you aren't looking to complete these. The major events are the plantations and slave ships. The plantations were featured in Black Flag, but they have been expanded in both scope and enjoyability here for a few reasons. The first is that the map is larger, leading to a more meaningful clearing of patrols, and with even more ways to approach an objective, but the enemy patrols feel more difficult to play around. And there seems to be a greater density of alarm bells, making stealth riskier with greater consequences. You need to take down only 20 overseers, and if you can get through it without any casualties, then you'll recruit a hefty amount of Maroons. If done in the night, then you have to do much the same, except you collect a key to open the huts that house the slaves. The final and biggest challenge with the biggest reward is the slave ships. The ships roam around the sea amongst a high-level fleet and will require your skills from Black Flag to properly defeat. Something I liked about these convoys is that they actually felt challenging this time around. In Black Flag, you could cheese convoys easily by just weakening one ship and boarding it, repairing the jackdaw, rinsing, and repeating. Here, some ships couldn't be boarded, which meant I had to play with more strategy. It still wasn't a major challenge, but I appreciate the change. Once you take down the surrounding ships, you can board the slave ship, take down the overseers, claim the loot, and free the slaves. This was one of the only instances where you'll be taking down other ships, and the overall lack of naval combat is why I said that this game felt closer to its series roots. Black Flag gameplay-wise felt like a pirate game that featured assassin elements, but the majority of objectives here are on land and under a hood, with anything sea-related being pretty thin, but retaining the established mechanical depth, which I really liked. The events are unique in that the slaves are susceptible to friendly fire. If you engage in open combat, the slaves could be hurt by the overseers, and if you happen to make use of one of your new weapons, they'll be caught in the near explosive impact. The blunderbuss is an absolute joy to use because it's simply busted in every sense of the word, acting as a shotgun of sorts that has a short range but with a wide spread. It can take down entire patrols in one well-placed shot, and while this is extremely overpowered, Assassin's Creed combat from Brotherhood to now has had no challenge whatsoever, so having a weapon that leans into the power fantasy is fine by me. The other new weapon here is the machete, and while it functions like any other weapon, its new animations make it a fresh addition, and truthfully some of these takedowns are insane. Otherwise, the normal gameplay loop is undisturbed, but I think I would have enjoyed more variety. I can't help but compare it to Liberation, which had canoes, alligators, and a whip to spice things up among others, but we will have to come back to that arguably unfair comparison later. For now, let's look at where this DLC separates itself from its sister game, and that is within the level design. Rather than spend a majority of the game on the seas, Freedom Cry sees you stealthing around on land, and in one case making use of a disguise to sneak into a plantation. You even have a fantastic set piece where you dive into a sinking ship to attempt to rescue some of the slaves that are chained inside. I found the layouts here to be more challenging, though some levels felt like busy work, and I hate saying this, padding. Let me explain. Throughout your journey, rather than crafting larger ammo pouches or finding new weapons, which in very rare cases you do, you'll be recruiting slaves and maroons for your cause by doing side quests around the map. It was the freeing of slaves mentioned earlier, along with the plantation and convoy raids. Having upgrades tied to this works well, as it's an easy way to take a 30-second detour to free a few slaves, and when in between missions, even a 10-minute detour into a plantation is easily justified by the reward, and the excuse for the gameplay loop is enticing alone. What I take issue with is blocking missions from the player until they reach a certain number of recruits, which more or less forces the repetitive side quests onto you. Again, the repetition is fine most of the time because it is meant as a detour that, if done naturally, is broken up by your other objectives. But when you're forced to do it over and over to hit an arbitrary requirement, which has no impact on the mission, it makes these side tangents feel like the game is trying to pad out its already slim runtime. Look, I don't care about a game or DLC's length, so long as it's a solid experience through and through. I've mentioned this especially when talking about the Uncharted games, as they can be completed within a day, but when the whole ride feels justified and of a high quality, then I'm okay with it. Freedom Cry will take you around 2.5 hours to finish its main story. This is a highball estimate, but it is how long it took me after dying an embarrassing amount of times, or dying to glitches sending me back 10 minutes at a time. I think if you're a competent gamer, then chances are you could round this out at 2 hours, which is fine. It's a DLC, and I don't think it should strive to be longer than it needs to be, but when a solid amount of time is spent doing what feels like filler content, it sours the whole experience. I'm going to tighten my tinfoil hat even harder and say that the filler was center-loaded for this exact reason. The DLC starts strong, meanders in the middle, and finishes strong too. And perhaps they had hoped reviews would forget about the second act being rather dull in comparison, but I don't know, I'm probably looking too far into it. Some of the other side activities here are enjoyable enough. Collectibles offer decent rewards, raiding ships to upgrade yours is still as fun as ever, and whaling and the diving bell even make a return. After the events of Black Flag, Edward became part of the Assassin Brotherhood in England, and sent the Jackdaw back to the West Indies to be sunk, and we, as Adewale, explore that very wreck, and can rock the very figurehead that Edward once did. It's simple but memorable, if not for the eel that directly blocks your path. The game knows that these little shits were a major pain in the ass, so rather than hide, it just stares you down. It knows that it's blocking the only path forward, and you just have to let him nip you one more time, that bastard. I should make it clear that outside of the padding, the gameplay here is fun and familiar, though this familiarity also applies to the glitches, which are not fun. Because Adewale's health is limited in this DLC, you can't take as many hits as you once could, and on one hand, that's great. I said the combat wasn't challenging, and a solid remedy to this would be, rather than make the enemies harder to kill, make you easier to kill. Because we all know how people get when somebody doesn't immediately combust after being stabbed. But seriously, making yourself a glass cannon could add balance, but only if the combat is reliable enough. In my Black Flag video, I mentioned that there were some bugs that got in the way, but I specifically said that they did not result in too much frustration because that's true. The most persistent glitch I came across was one where I could simply not engage in combat while boarding a ship. I couldn't counter, punch, lock on, shoot, nothing, and when I inevitably got hit once or twice, it would fix itself. The reason it didn't bug me there is that your base health was easily upgraded early on, allowing this issue to be minor at worst. Here, with the lower base health, it resulted in death, and keep in mind, when you want to board a slave ship, you have to eliminate the entire convoy, so finally boarding it only to die to a bug that is entirely out of your control was really rough. So rather than dwelling on the gameplay missteps, let's look at the story missteps, where it just feels as though nothing happens. I like that Adewale is a likable character from one of his first pieces of dialogue.
As a boy, I fled the same fate.
Why would you risk recapture?
Men of principle know the bigger risk is to turn away.
That line is all I need to hear for me to fall back in love with this guy, and he keeps this consistent level-headedness throughout the story, but has plenty of emotion. Despite Adewale wanting to initially head straight back to his assassin brethren, he becomes entangled with the slave rebellion of Port-au-Prince, and communicates with a woman named Bastienne to uncover a French conspiracy led by the governor, and eventually, Adewale kills that governor and leaves Port-au-Prince with a newfound resolve to aid any slaves he comes across. There's a fair number of things that happen in between, but those are the major details, and I can appreciate the attention given to the slaves here and how they were treated, and of course solid context is given within the Animus entries. I wasn't a fan of the many time skips though, as the entire DLC takes place over the course of 2 years, which makes it feel as though we are only experiencing little slices of a larger story. If you don't happen to notice the time skips, then you question why Adewale wants to leave so bad in the first place, and I understand that this is just a one sequence DLC, but it truly feels as though nothing happens. I mean, sure, stuff happens, but the story more than anything else made me question what this game's purpose is at all. Why was it made? What was it trying to say? As a DLC, does it really need to say anything? The most common answer as to why this was made and what its purpose is comes from the developers themselves, who said that the DLC would hint at the next major game in the series. What that connection is unclear. Maybe the focus on the French would hint at Paris being the next location, but we've seen plenty of French references up to this point. Maybe it's the box that shows up, which seems to be the same box from the short film Assassin's Creed Embers, and shows up again in both Rogue alongside Adewale. And that box could also hint at Chronicles China. The final blunderbuss shows links to China, but I don't know if that's concrete enough. The developers also stated that the hint would only be understood in the future, so again, the box idea makes a decent amount of sense, as does the connections to Rogue. I saw some people saying that this image here, which featured in an email talking about the potential time periods, hinted at Egypt, but this shows more resemblance to the scrapped Prince of Persia reboot screenshots that leaked around that time. Maybe that scrapped reboot was then turned into Assassin's Creed Origins, as developers had stated before that ancient Egypt was a point of interest for them. And maybe all of these are the correct answer, and they're all hints at the future of the series, but I'm not sure what context this DLC offers towards that outside of what we've seen in Black Flag. So again, regardless of the answer, I think the question remains: what is the purpose of this DLC? Perhaps it's as simple as exploring Adewale further and having some gameplay with him as an assassin, and I think that's a valid excuse. But I then wonder why they later chose to make this a standalone DLC. I mean, the game is very dependent on the assumption that you've played Black Flag, which is reasonable and reinforced throughout the game. There's a general lack of tutorials, which as someone who recently dove into Black Flag's deep end, I appreciated. But assuming you get past the gameplay hurdles and you have a story that doesn't make much sense and doesn't say much, and a main character that you have no context for. So it's clear that you should play Black Flag before this. This DLC also doesn't choose to say anything regarding the Assassin-Templar conflict, but I think at this point I might be asking too much of it. But even what is here doesn't say much about Adewale or the world that he's in. The reason I believe I have all these admittedly unreasonable expectations is that Liberation was a surprisingly good time. Now, I mentioned before that this DLC is $15 while Liberation HD is $20, and yet Liberation has more levels, more customization, a story that tries to say something, more new mechanics and enemies, more locations to traverse, and for all intents and purposes felt like a solid side story that hit all the beats the rest of the series has up to this point. So either Liberation is an extremely sweet deal, or Freedom Cry is overpriced, and I feel inclined to say the latter. I think this DLC should have been half of its current price. Either that, or I'd prefer a DLC that is $20 but is more fleshed out. What's worse is that this isn't our first foray into freeing slaves while also dealing with assassin affairs, as that was a running theme in Liberation. Overall, despite enjoying the gameplay loop and really liking Adewale, I feel pretty disappointed with this DLC. It felt like it was just too short for the price of admission, and when a solid chunk of that runtime is busy work full of the same bugs present in Black Flag, I couldn't help but feel as though this was an underwhelming experience. It felt like it had no purpose. It didn't do anything new outside of a few new weapons and locations, and ironically, despite being linked to an Assassin's Creed game that famously broke away from the, at that point, formulaic structure of the games, feels very by the numbers. If we disconnect the price tag here and look at the game in a vacuum, I think the DLC is worth playing. Even if it lacked innovation or even a purpose at points, what's there is still enjoyable. It's only when we look at the asking price and the qualities of its contemporaries in the same price range that things begin to look bad for Freedom Cry, and I'd only recommend it if it's on sale for $10 or less. I think these reasons are why Freedom Cry isn't talked about that much these days. Sure, plenty played it, and I'm sure some people remember it, but when I ask about it, rather than getting a response of, yeah, I love that one, most just responded with a more somber, oh yeah, that one. Thank you so much for watching. I want to give a big shout out to our Patreon supporters and our YouTube members for making videos like these possible. Boy Aqua Fanboy, Lane, Sad AMV, It's SRTW, Worshipper of the Olympians, Aiden Spark 77, Logan Casey, A-Beat, Ben Conway, Bossian, Chiefy, Edgar Sunday, Gonzo Gonzalez, J.MP3, Lee Mercuza, Mark Short, Pyrite, Ryan Hutcherson, Sean Bailey, The Gamer Lorian, and Worshipper of the Olympians again. Thank you for doubling up. I don't know if you know, but you get the same stuff on whether you support me on YouTube members or Patreon. You get the same benefits, which is videos early, some reflective posts about where I think I could improve on the latest videos, and updates about where things are going, and much more. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to keep updated and you want to see what's going on with videos, at ThatBoyAqua. I'll have a link in the description. And if you want to hear more of me and potentially Nam's Compendium, we have a podcast together called Polar Opposites, and we actually just released a new episode talking about conventions like Anime Expo, E3, and what are sort of the pros and cons of them. So if you're interested in that or any of our other episodes, feel free to check that in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. It severely helps me out during this time of year. I love you guys. Take care.